Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Gary Seymour, Director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. Thank you all for joining us for this book celebration for Professor Beth Derderian's new book, Art Capital, Politics of Art and the Making of the Louvre Abu Dhabi. I encourage all of you to get a copy of the book. With all of the negative news that comes out of the Middle East, it's welcome to have a reminder that there are positive cultural developments in the region as well. Before I turn things over to my colleague from the Anthropology department, I want to say from a personal standpoint how lucky we are that Beth has agreed to join the Crown Center and the Anthropology department at Brandeis University. She's a wonderful colleague, excellent teacher and scholar, and a lovely person. Yes. So I also want to mention that at the end of this event, we're going to have a lottery for students to give away a copy of the book and a precious water flask from the Crown Center. So I'll announce the winner at the end. We're also going to be doing a virtual lottery. So those of you online, if you go to the Crown Center Instagram feed, Crown Center Middle East, you can click on our latest video and there'll be instructions on how to enter, and you'll be virtually. You have to do that soon because the lottery ends at 8 p.m. Finally, I want to just moderator for our excellent panel who will be discussing the book. Noora Lori is an associate in international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. She directs the Middle East and North Africa Initiative at the Pardee School and serves as a faculty fellow of graduate affairs in the provost office. Her research focuses on citizenship and migration in the Middle East and in comparative perspective. Her first book, Offshore Citizens, Permanent Temporary Status in the Gulf, received 3 book awards from the American Political Science and the International Studies Association, and she's published in a number of journals. We're proud to say that she was actually a Goldman Faculty Lee Fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, so we're delighted that we've been able to continue our association with her. So before I turn things over to Noora and the panel, I'll ask my colleague from the Anthropology department, Professor Rashid, to say a few things.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and certainly I appreciate that the Crown Center extended me an invitation to give a few words. As was already commented, we are very happy on the side of Anthropology to have Beth joining us, particularly because myself as an archaeologist see the possibilities of having another person interested in the ancient world of the Middle East joining our ranks. So fabulous. Now, if anyone thought museums are only institutions that serve society by collecting, conserving, researching, interpreting, and exhibiting tangible and intangible heritage, the book Art Capital by Beth Derderian is yet another reminder that museums are also arenas of contestation. In that sense, they are prime movers in the process of social memory, stages where remembrance and forgetting are forged simultaneously in the transgenerational transfer of cultural knowledge. This superb ethnographic exploration of the Louvre Abu Dhabi presents a case study of the possibilities in cultural production and diplomacy by a market-driven institution, revealing a new model for hybrid transnational museums in the 21st century. museum franchising becomes a luring alternative to the traditional state-sponsored cultural representation, embodying a growing entanglement of art with global capital and moving beyond the traditional nationalist functions. It also explores the tensions between commercial interests, state power, and calls for inclusivity and decolonization. In the process of doing so, it also illustrates how this new capitalist model shapes artistic practice and cultural authority in complex ways, highlighting simultaneously how cultural projects can be at the service of national branding and soft power. At its core, Art Capital provides a crucial insight into how global economic forces and political ambitions are reshaping what museums are, who they serve, and how art functions in the contemporary world, using the Louvre Abu Dhabi not only as a key, but also a highly controversial example. The book is therefore a novel addition to the study of the political economy of museums, a field that seeks to explore their power dynamics, including their relations to governmentality, philanthrocapitalism, neoliberalism, and labor. Histories of patronage, philanthropy, and corporate sponsorship illuminate ways that museums contribute to and benefit from the accumulation of capital. They also help us understand the colonial nature of museums and critiques of their universality. One may wonder if institutional shifts guided by neoliberalization, a trend that in other parts of the world can be traced back to the 1970s, could bring to closure perennial, thorny issues of repatriation and restitution. Prime examples like the Parthenon friezes or the fragments of the stela from El Rashid held by the British Museum, or the several Benin bronzes widely dispersed in numerous European museums. All in all, Art Capital is a well-researched project, nuanced in its inquiries and beautifully crafted. Congratulations, Beth, and thanks for helping me expand my horizons. I'm sure that the panel and the audience will unpack the many intellectual gems contained in your book. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. So as Gary mentioned, I'm Noora Lori. I'm previously a Goldman Faculty Leave Fellow at the Crown Center, and they can't get rid of me. And I'm so happy to be back. Please enjoy the wonderful food. And also, we really want to keep this as a conversation. So we're really looking forward to your questions. Before we start, I would love to take a moment to share the bios of the esteemed panelists that I get to have this conversation with today. So first and foremost, Beth Derderian, is it kind of right? Close enough, close enough. Is the Renée and Lester Crown Chair, Assistant Professor of Modern Middle East Studies and Anthropology at the Crown Center for the Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. Prior to Brandeis, she was an Assistant Professor at the College of Worcester and a postdoctoral associate at Yale University's Council on Middle East Studies. She holds a PhD in Anthropology from Northwestern University and an MA in Near Eastern and Museum Studies from NYU. Dr. Attiya Ahmad is an Associate Professor of Anthropology and International Affairs at George Washington University. Her research examines the gendered intersections of contemporary Islamic movements and political economic processes across the Middle East, South Asia, and Southern Europe. Her first book, Everyday Conversions, Islam, Domestic Work, and Migrants, South Asian migrant women in Kuwait, is a multi-award-winning study of migrant domestic workers' religious conversions in the Arab Gulf, offering a groundbreaking analysis of faith, labor, and migration. It's actually one of the first books I read on migration in the Gulf and inspired me. She is currently completing a book manuscript tentatively titled The Muslim Grand Tour, Travel at the Edges of Anthropology, based on extensive ethnographic fieldwork and archival research conducted in Turkey, Spain, and the United Kingdom. She's also in the early stages of a long-term research project exploring the role of medieval Andalusian silk textiles in shaping interregional connections among Muslim, Jewish, and Christian communities in the Mediterranean world. So fascinating. Finally, last but not least, our esteemed colleague, Dr. Andrew McClellan, is a professor of art history at Tufts University. He has many publications, and numerous publications on the history of museums include a book on the origins of the Louvre in Paris and an article on of new museums in Abu Dhabi. He will spend next academic year as the Robert Clark Visiting Professor of Art History at Williams College, where he will complete a new book on American art museums. With that, I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Beth, for some opening remarks.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm excited for the conversation to follow. If I can have the first slide. So I just wanted to share, assuming that not everyone has read the book yet, the argument of the book. So the central argument of the book is that there are two important phenomena in museum and art practice in the 21st century. The first is capitalization, meaning the rising influence of capital, corporate interests, financialization of museums and art practice, as well as major pushes to diversify museums, their staff, their collections, their exhibitions. And so I argue in the book that we can look to what's happening in Abu Dhabi, in the UAE's art world, to understand these two intersections. And the next slide shows a brief summary of each of the chapters. So each chapter looks at one intersection of these sort of two phenomena of sort of pushes to capitalize and pushes to diversify. So these changes include changes in the forms of arts organizations. They're no longer easily categorizable as public or private, state or non-state. So we see new types of arts organizations, new types of museum organizations forming. We also see changes in the way that curators and organizers are leveraging artists' backgrounds, particularly citizenship status in the UAE. This has definite effects on artists' ability to be successful in a global contemporary art world. The third chapter is about critique and this idea that some sort of socio-political critique is necessary for a work to be legitimized as contemporary art. And if one must critique the state, how does that happen in places where critiquing the state is not legal? Very relevant question for our times. Chapter 4 is about corporate practices that get translated into artists and gallery workers' self-presentation. So this idea of what constitutes being professional was a term that came up a lot in my work. And then the final chapter is about how organizers manage diverse publics in order to be maximally applicable and welcoming to everyone. And this really coalesces around the idea of tolerance, which runs through the book a lot. So that's just a brief snapshot to give you a sense of where we're starting from.
That was actually very succinct for a book opening. Before we delve more deeply into the Louvre Abu Dhabi, Andrea, I wanted to come to you since you've written about the Louvre in Paris. And can you tell us a bit about the invention of the Louvre as a public museum? And this idea, was it always a public museum? What is the museum's relationship to the French state?
I should have tested this before. Is it working? Okay. Yes, thanks, Noora, and thanks. A wonderful book, Beth. Really, it's really a great addition to the literature. So speaking about the Louvre in Paris, which opened in 1793 at the height of the French Revolution, I think it set a precedent for national museums pretty much everywhere in three particular ways, maybe more, but three certainly that have relevance for us today. And they are to do with access, ownership, and patrimony. So in terms of access, there were other museums and collections, princely collections, that were open to the public before the revolution, but only selectively. And in the case of the Louvre in Paris, access was universal and unconditional. Interestingly, visitor reports from the first decade or so of the Louvre's opening show that there was a division, a noticeable division between ordinary Parisian visitors and international tourists. And both were important for the French state. Ownership. So the revolution nationalized the property of the crown, the church, and émigré aristocrats, meaning that ownership of the Louvre's contents transferred to the French Republic, and by extension, therefore, to citizens of the state. The Louvre, in effect, became the property of the people. Third, by nationalizing buildings, artworks, libraries, archives, etc., the revolution created a national patrimony and tangible cultural heritage. Careful stewardship of that heritage became a sign of a responsible republic, which was important for both domestic messaging and foreign consumption. In effect, the Louvre countered the image of France abroad during the revolution as a savage and uncivilized nation following the eradication of religion and public execution of the king, the queen, and enemies of the state. So I think all three of those, in one form or another, are still important to both the French Louvre, but also national museums everywhere.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I was kind of sticking with this, some of the initial concepts that come up in the book. Beth, you discussed Tony Bennett's concept of an exhibitionary complex. So for non-specialists like myself, can you explain what is an exhibitionary complex, and how do you see it in your work?
So a lot of the foundational scholarship in museum studies, including Andrew's work and Tony Bennett's work, has really looked at how, again, as Andrew mentioned, the Louvre becomes sort of the prototypical public art museum, and it's tied to the French state. And Tony Bennett's idea of the exhibitionary complex was referring to not just museums like the Louvre, but also all kinds of exhibitionary infrastructures that supported the nation state. So, for example, in this period, in the 19th century in particular, there's also a lot of World's Fairs, right? So World's Fairs are also another sort of exhibition infrastructure that's also supporting, the British Empire, the French Empire at the time. And so the exhibitionary complex becomes a way of sort of understanding how museums and exhibitionary spaces are used to basically persuade the public to identify with the state. So we could think of it kind of as like the military industrial complex, but for museums. And one of the main arguments of the book is that, yes, museums are still serving the state. No one can take a look at the museums that are being developed in Abu Dhabi, the ones that exist already, and say that they are not there to serve the state. However, my argument is that museums are now really strongly influenced by the market, and the market needs come first, and they dominate. And they're also what's more public about how these museums are operating. And so the book also defines the concept of the market exhibitionary complex, looking at these exhibitionary infrastructures that serve the market. And again, part of the first chapter is really about the ways that these different organizations that appear to be, maybe run by a member of the royal family, but they're independent. Where does the money come from? Looking at these sorts of hybridities that form in this moment, and the rise of the market as a primary paradigm in museum practice in a way that it was not before.
Fascinating. Thank you. Andrew, I'll come back to you, and then Attiya, I'm coming your way. What were the divisions between fine art and heritage in the original Louvre? And maybe can you say a little bit, because this comes up in your book about heritage versus fine art. And could you guys give us a definition? What is the difference between fine art and heritage? And what were the divisions between fine arts and heritage in the original Louvre? What was in the original Louvre?
Fine arts are part of heritage, but heritage, of course, is much broader in type, and it extends to intangible heritage, of course, as well. But at the Louvre in the late 1790s, we're talking about what we would call the fine arts exclusively. Painting, sculpture, drawings, architecture would be included, but the Louvre was a work of art in its own right. And there was a firm division at that time between those fine arts and the decorative arts, certainly ceramics, textiles, and so forth, which were not part of the Louvre. They would have been considered part of heritage, but as historical objects rather than as fine art. And that essential division descends from the Renaissance and was codified not least by the French before the Louvre, but then the Louvre sort of institutionalizes that difference. And that's still a difference that one finds, generally speaking, in art museums to this day.
And I'll come to as a follow-up, because you mentioned in the book that I had the actual page number. Hold on. It's I think in my other set of notes. But there's a pushback, right? There's your interlocutors were insistent that this wasn't heritage, right? Could you expand on that?
I think that same paradigm that Andrew is defining, this difference between fine art and decorative art, is still really powerful in the contemporary art world today. And so a lot of my interlocutors, when they would get asked, how does your heritage influence your work, they took it as a slight, as a sign that they were not critical enough, that they were not thoughtful enough. And there was also a bit of a critique among many of the artists that people were being selected for shows based on sort of using their heritage, referencing their Emiratiness or their, whatever their background was in their work in order to get access, get included in shows. And that was not, it was not a compliment. And so there is still, I think, preserved quite strongly this distinction between what constitutes, what they would call contemporary art, but they did not use the word heritage. They did not use patrimoine. They did not use turath. They did not use heritage in any of its forms. And it was, I learned it was an insult in many contexts. Yeah, that division still stands.
I think that's a good segue considering
to the questions I had.
Yeah.
Thank you. So first, congratulations again. Can folks hear me? Let's make sure. Congratulations again, Beth, on a splendid book. It was an absolute pleasure to read. Now, one of the striking features of your book is how it both opens up new areas of inquiry. It also connects to multiple established scholarly realms. Now, with respect to Gulf studies, your book provides important new insights into a realm of activity, museum worlds, artistic production, and artistic networks, and connects to existing Gulf scholarship focused on state formation, citizenship and belonging, labor, and finance. With that in mind, can you tell us how your examination of this field of museum studies and artistic production and artistic networks intersects with existing scholarship on Gulf studies, which often emphasizes their relatively recent formation, their reliance on petrodollar revenue, their situatedness within the British Imperium of the past, the US Imperium at the present, the importance of their sovereign wealth funds to global capital, to finance, and then also, and with respect to questions of citizenship and belonging in the Gulf, a great deal of scholarship focuses on the fact that the majority of the Gulf states' populations are comprised of non-citizens, often glossed as migrant workers. There's also questions of exploitation and exclusion and the complex forms of belonging and residency that have formed in the region. And we're fortunate here, I should note, so perhaps before throwing it over to you, since we have Dr. Lori here, who's an expert and who has written one of the most significant works examining these questions, I'd be remiss if I didn't turn it to you for a moment about
Yeah, I was actually also thinking about your work, so this is like a good love fest. But I was you have a quote, Beth, in the book on page 8 where it says, "This very question, how to manage and govern a diverse population, is central to the intersection of capitalization and inclusivity in art museums that I examine here. But that point of how to manage and govern a diverse population was something that just really came up a lot for me. When you're talking about a place like the UAE, I mean, the Gulf more generally, 60% of the aggregate population is non-citizen. The UAE, you're talking about 90%. And it's incorrect to say that they're temporary. You have people who may be in their fourth generation, Indian community who's been there prior to the partition of India, but they're on temporary visas. And so when I first started my research, I was really interested in what does it mean how do you, like, modern states are all about settling mobile population. So what does governance really look like if everyone is always moving? The truth is they're not. But the most kind of inclusive answers actually came from the Ministry of Interior for me. It was really surprising that it was the police who really narrated when I said, okay, citizens versus non-citizens. They said, we don't care about this distinction. We have to serve everyone is our citizen here. And so it had this, and they talked about, going to other countries like China and Bangladesh and working with police forces there, learning other languages, and sort of what the state has to do to adapt to a really, diverse population. Of course, with that adaptation and it's also extreme surveillance, right? So I'm not trying to romanticize, but it was also surprising to me that the Ministry of Interior seemed to have a more kind of diverse framing of who the people of Dubai were, more than some of the like Ministry of Culture or Tourism images of what it means to be Emirati. So this is a very long-winded way of bringing it back to you, Beth, to say, yeah, what those points about managing and governing and the way the kafala system comes into some of your research?
Thank you for the questions. I think, in terms of there is a lot of Gulf scholarship on the Gulf on migration, and a lot of it has focused on, I mean, your work was very influential. Neha Vora's work on Indian workers in the UAE who'd been there, again, as Noora says, for generations. There's a lot of really phenomenal scholarship, and Neha's work was also one of the first to look at she's looking at middle-class workers, right? And so when the museum projects were announced in 2006, 2007, I was really interested in who's going to work in these museums, who's going to go to these museums. And I think the book is hopefully a contribution to understanding different classes of expatriate workers. So a lot of the people that I worked with had papers from Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, or they had one Emirati parent and another non-Emirati parent. And so I had not seen a lot of these communities represented in the literature. And your work came out after the dissertation work was done. So some of, and I also ran into folks who had someone who was born and raised in the Emirates, had an Emirati father, but had a passport from Tanzania. So how does this, so thinking about how belonging works, but also how one's documents inform one's ability to work in different places, right? So the book is hopefully a contribution and building on some really foundational, important scholarship on migration in the Gulf. And I think one thing that's particularly unique about the way that art is often understood and museums are often understood as sort of forms of soft power and cultural diplomacy is that they can sort of pacify populations. And one of the ways that this came out in the research was watching people who had been, again, born and raised in the UAE, had lived there for perhaps generations, but did not hold citizenship for a variety of reasons, and watching when they were included to represent the state and when they were not. And as I detail in chapter 3, this could be very painful for artists who felt Emirati in their bones. They identified with this place. They felt they belonged. They had built lives there, and then to be included and excluded sort of at the state's whim when it could benefit them. And the formulation that I use sort of in alongside offshore citizens is contingent citizens. So the state, when it's helpful, when it's beneficial for the state, when it makes the Emirati state look tolerant and inclusive to have people with papers from 17 different countries represented in an exhibition, then folks might be included. And at other points, they're excluded. And so it becomes this sort of commodification of their background in the name of sort of a tolerance, showcasing the UAE as this tolerant place.
I know that you might have a follow-up. I want to kind of tease out this relationship between the two Louvres. And maybe let's start with what the French public's reaction or to the Louvre coming to Abu Dhabi. Could you say something a little bit about the French public's reaction to the Louvre and now also the response to the Guggenheim?
Yes. So it was quite controversial. The Louvre Paris now has another branch in France, in Lens. But at the time that these museums were announced was not sort of known for franchising. The Guggenheim was, because of course the Guggenheim has a location in Bilbao that was the Bilbao location has been very, very popular and studied in museum studies. When the original agreement was made, the French public were not happy. There was an open letter that was signed by a number of curators that accused the Louvre of selling its soul, vendre son âme, there were also some boycotts. There were a lot of protests also in New York, at the Guggenheim in New York, including, projections on the exterior of the facade of the museum, as well as raining protest leaflets down the center atrium. And a lot of the concern was about who was going to build the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi and the way that those workers would be treated. So there were very different sort of concerns, I think, in France versus in New York. I will note that a lot of the protests that went on, and there was a group called Gulf Labor that formed to push the Guggenheim, as well as NYU Abu Dhabi, which was under construction. A lot of these entities that are on Saadiyat Island to push them to have more humane practices for their the workers. At this point, I mean, the Guggenheim broke ground only actually a few years ago. So it has, at the point that these protests were happening, there was actually no construction going on. But over time, the controversy has died down a bit. By the time the Louvre Abu Dhabi opened in 2017, about 10 years after its announcement, Macron was there, I believe, the correct president. There were like 3 French presidents that oversaw the whole time period between the Louvre's and Abu Dhabi's announcement and its actual opening. But it was very much, the opening itself was like this sort of diplomatic spectacle with, royalty from Morocco and the French president and all of these functionaries. So it calmed down.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes why buying a museum is more, buying culture is better, or sorry, worse than exploitation through colonial extraction of, where are these materials that are in the Louvre, where are they from? But I digress. Attiya, can I come to you? Because I know you had a question about this.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question. So I'm curious, one of the threads that works its way throughout the book, and that I just want to put a finger on right now, is about the other forms of belonging, residency, and transnational connections that develop in and through museums and artistic production and coalescing networks. For example, from what I understand, the Louvre in France, sorry, between accents there, France, has served as an important training ground for students, would-be curators, and the like. Are these transnational circulations back and forth with respect to training and learning? Were those developing while you were doing field work? How might the Louvre in Abu Dhabi connect to existing networks and systems of artistic formations in the Emirates?
So part of the original agreements for both the Louvre and the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi were that the museums would train up and coming generations of Emiratis for specialized roles in museums. The number I want to say off the top of my head from the Guggenheim was like, 300 positions or something like that. So there was a goal to develop and curators and conservators and other sort of specialized staff. And the idea being that these experts who came from the Louvre in France or were hired and therefore represented the Louvre in France, that they would be cultivating up and coming generations of museum workers. The Louvre also made an organization called Agence France Musée, the French Museums Agency, that basically pooled together resources from 12 different French museums, including the Louvre, because they were all national museums, so the Musée d'Orsay, the Louvre in Paris, to send resources to the Louvre Abu Dhabi. So this included staff, but it also included like collections as well, because part of the agreement was also that a certain percentage of the Louvre Paris's collections would be available in the Louvre Abu Dhabi every year. So there has been a dedicated attempt to, again, sort of cultivate next generations of museum staff. In terms of the artistic formation, I think one of the things that has been really interesting is watching which artists are selected to be collected by these different museums and when. That those selections have definitely been part of the formation of what I would consider to be an Emirati art historical canon as well. The artists that get selected and validated by entities like the Louvre Abu Dhabi and the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi are definitely part of the canon. And that gets sort of adopted by other institutions. And the other thing I will say is that all of these arts organizations, whether it was the Louvre Abu Dhabi or sort of emerging art centers or art foundations, almost all of them had programs to support emerging artists of varying degrees. Some of them were quite educational, some of them were residency-based. The Louvre Abu Dhabi has a showcase for sort of emerging or just emerged artists in the Emirates that has also been an important way of supporting artists and making them visible outside of just the Emirates in a way that's been really important.
Wonderful, thank you. So Andrea, I'll come to you now and just invite you if you have any thoughts about, the kind of French reaction, the Louvre community in Paris, and any juicy details you can provide. That was not one of the scripted questions, but I'm curious. Another question, which is, more about your scholarship, is so you've written about museum publics in the late 20th century versus museum publics in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I wonder if you could share some of that with us. Who's going to museums? How are people thinking about museums' role in their society, in their publics? How's that been changed from what you've observed? So 2 parts.
That's a lot. Yeah, a lot one could say. About the French reaction, it's interesting that there was public dissatisfaction, skepticism, cynicism about the French government's involvement with the government in the Emirates. But $30 billion is a lot of money, and that buys, a lot of cultural capital. So ultimately, the government prevailed, and things have died down. But the Louvre, it was important, I think, in a part of the world that has no museum or had no museum infrastructure, essentially. If you're going to build museums, they need to be legible and legitimate, and buying the Louvre's name and buying the talent at the Louvre, buying the art at the Louvre for a 30-year period, and then moving on to the British for the Zayed Museum, and then moving on to the Americans with the Guggenheim Museum is covering a lot of bases. And gaining a lot of currency, in a cultural and financial way right off the top. But the question of who goes to museums is very context specific, right? I mean, it's be a different question, different answer if you're in Western Europe versus Eastern Europe or South Asia. And, it is a really interesting open question, what the public for the Louvre or the Guggenheim and so forth in Abu Dhabi is going to look like. And it touches also on the question of, well, why did they invest so much money in these museums? What is the purpose of museum building? Who do they want it to be for? Is it as much for telegraphing things to the rest of the world as it is catering to their own populations? And then you get into this very complicated question of, well, what does the museum public look like in Abu Dhabi? Are we talking about Emirati citizens? Are we talking about South Asian migrant workers? I don't know. That's.
Yeah, I think the publics are different for each of the museums in Abu Dhabi. But I would first say, Abu Dhabi announced these plans in 2006, 2007. But there have been museums, robust museums in Sharjah, in the Emirate of Sharjah, since the early 90s. There had been exhibitions of local artists and shows, and so there is and there has been museum expertise in the Emirates, and those are distinct projects. I mean, folks would usually tell me Abu Dhabi is for the government projects and Dubai is for the commercial projects, and Sharjah, that's like our history, our museums. But in terms of and even one of the reasons why Hura al-Qasmi in Sharjah created the Sharjah Art Foundation was because they were having biennials, and she wanted to cultivate audiences of people who lived in Sharjah so they would have access to a museum year round. In Abu Dhabi, the project that was announced for Saadiyat, again in 2006, 2007, it was meant to be spectacular. It was meant to be awe-inspiring, and it was meant to have something for everyone. So the museums, the Louvre and the Guggenheim, as well as the Zayed National Museum, there was also initially a maritime museum planned and a performing arts center that was designed by Zaha Hadid. All of these were part of the cultural district on Saadiyat Island, but Saadiyat also included like NYU, Abu Dhabi. There was also going to be an outdoor leisure, like a lagoons neighborhood. It was like this tourist, there was a marina district planned. So the whole island was kind of meant to be this like tourist, like whatever kind of tourism you want, we have it for you here. As it turns out, the Louvre, every time I've been, it's been quite packed. And I will admit that there are more people in the central hall that's on the cover of the book where people take selfies than maybe in the galleries. But it has been quite busy, and it really is everyone. When I was there just earlier in January, I counted 13 school buses in the parking lot, from all kinds of local schools, government schools, as well as, an Indian school and an American school. I think the audience really is meant to be everyone, and they have also capitalized on it being close to a cruise ship docking point. So there's also people that very clearly walked off a cruise ship. The audience at the Zayed National Museum, which I was able to go to, it just opened. I was there a few weeks ago. It was much more based on how people were dressed. It was much more an Emirati crowd, and the museum, the text in it is very much pitched at Emiratis. It's about their land, their culture, their history, and I think that's quite different. And the Guggenheim, I think similarly to the Louvre, is envisioned as something for everyone. And maybe to loop back to Noora's point, that there are a lot of people in the Emirates that will say, whether Emirati or whether they hold citizenship or not, who will talk about the community of people who lives here, like all of us, right? And recognizing the contributions of long-term residents. And I think the Louvre and the Guggenheim in particular are envisioned as being museums for the entirety of that community. But I would also say, like many museums, even here in the United States and elsewhere, you don't often see in museum publics don't often include like lower class working people. That's often not in their address. You don't see, people in the Met who are, wearing, appear to be auto mechanics or things like that, just like you wouldn't see that in the Emirates either. But I don't know that that's different.
Maybe just sorry before this is an warning to the audience. We're coming to you soon, so start thinking about your questions.
I was just going to ask. I have a couple of questions. Do we have enough time?
Yeah.
Okay, super. Okay, so another thread that I really, really appreciated in your book is your discussion of the significance of museums to the formation and not merely the expression of subjects and subjectivity. And then museums as gallery spaces, as you discuss in your book, hail consumers, so connected to processes of consumerism. They hail students, so as sites of pedagogy and learning. They hail citizens or citizenship and belonging at local, national, regional, and transnational scales. And so I wanted to invite you to maybe reflect and share with the audience a bit of the insights from your book about the importance of these spaces to subjectivity and subject formation. And are they, and maybe another way of framing it, are these alternatives to malls, or are they commensurate to other consumer spaces, or are there other objectives at play in terms of the of the museum as an important formation of subjects and populations?
I think definitely some of my interlocutors would say that they're very consumer spaces. Openings were usually quite well attended. And I was in Al Sarkal Avenue a few weeks ago on the weekend, and it was absolutely packed. There are art galleries there. There are designer showrooms there. It's very sort of mixed, again, to that hybridity. But it was very clearly like a place to just go and be on the weekend and spend time. So I think there is the potential for integration, right, of museum and art spaces into sort of broader spaces of leisure that is, as someone who has a love-hate relationship with museums, but ultimately loves them. I think it's great to see people walking into museums, even if they don't, maybe have never gone to a museum before, or if they haven't been in a gallery, or they just happen to walk by one and they think I'll go in there. Like, I think that's a phenomenal thing. There is, I would say there is certainly a commercial element. Malls in the UAE are in the Gulf in general are such interesting spaces. So interesting. Rana Mutawa has a really great book about this as well. But malls become, especially in the months where it's so hot, malls become spaces where people come to do like walking. There's like ladies walking groups in the malls because it's air conditioned and it's inside, so they can do that. The DMV is in the mall, the post office is in the mall, the grocery store is in the mall, and malls have free parking. So they become this place where you can, get your haircut and have lunch and do 17 other things. And so again, to this point about like museums being accessible, if a museum or an art space wants to be welcoming, a mall would be a great place for them to be.
And then finally, picking up on an issue that Professor Uthed mentioned. So in addition to capitalization and inclusivity, another major set of issues many museums worldwide are grappling with are questions of repatriation, restitution, and decolonization. Do these issues arise in the Emirati context? Do they arise with respect to objects on display in the Louvre Abu Dhabi?
So the question of decolonization, certainly there is an attempt to integrate people of all different backgrounds into museum and art organization work in the UAE in a way that I think is really helpful. The Guggenheim Abu Dhabi has also, they use the term West Asia. instead of Middle East. And that is a particular choice because they want to, number one, emphasize the connections to South Asia, which are really significant in the Gulf. But also because Middle East is where do you have to be standing for it to be Middle and East? It's a very Western oriented term, and West Asia allows for sort of a rethinking of those connections and orientations. In terms of repatriation, one of the curses and challenges, I think, of starting a major collection like the Louvre Abu Dhabi did in the 2010s was that there's a lot more sort of oversight of sale of artifacts at this point. And so the Louvre Abu Dhabi does have its own collection that was mainly acquired in the 2010s, but anything that's been sold in that era, it's much more, there's such higher scrutiny on the provenance of it. And the collection is, especially compared to the Louvre Paris, is quite small. It's, I think the collections database that's online has like 8,000 artifacts in it. And it's unlikely, given the scrutiny on the provenance at this point, that any of those objects would be subject to repatriation. If there were artifacts that were on display that were considered to be problematic, they could also be maybe from the Louvre in Paris, because that's, I think, where any objects of questionable provenance or that were acquired in circumstances that are now considered to be less than savory, I think those might be the ones that would attract the most scrutiny.
I'm coming to the audience, but Beth, you said something that I couldn't let go of, which was that you said that you both love and hate museums. And so I can't help but ask, what made you write this book? What was, was there an aha moment? Yeah, what pushed you, this love-hate to?
I mean, I ultimately love museums, but I think there are also ways in which they tend to be very problematic and have been very problematic. And I think that there's a lot of power in representing history and representing other communities, right? Like there's a lot of power in representation. I have to think that I'm an anthropologist. But yeah, I think, when I was doing, this actually started as an MA thesis. And I realized it was just such an interesting question of like how these museums would integrate into a community that was quite different, and what would that look like, and how would it change things? And it really started out of this curiosity, but yeah, like loving museums, but also recognizing that there is power, and power should always be questioned.
What a line. I love that. Audience members, can I come to you? Yeah, come in. Go ahead. Are we doing mics or if you can come up here, sorry.
There is one over here.
Oh, there's no.
So thank you very much. Is this working? Very good. Thank you. So I really enjoyed the talk and all the questions. My question is about the choice of artifact in terms of identity, national origin of the artifacts. So clearly first priority is to display the heritage of the United Arab Emirates. But beyond that, is there a higher priority for Arab heritage of the rest of the Arab world, or are they indifferent about the origins of anything that's not from the UAE? Thank you.
So the Louvre Abu Dhabi is like the Louvre in Paris. It's a universal survey museum, meaning that it's trying to show all sort of an overview of all of humankind and human civilization. So I would say the Zayed National Museum has definitely been quite the displays are very visually sparse for my experience in museums, and very limited in terms of what Emirati artifacts and history can go on display. But for the Louvre Abu Dhabi, there are 12 main galleries, and it's, I think, intentionally designed as to respond to some of the museum studies criticism of the Louvre in Paris, which is that the Louvre in Paris being organized in a way where all the other civilizations are, you sort of like go up from the basement to French civilization and French art at the top. And the Louvre Abu Dhabi is 12 galleries on one level that you go through, and it's quite literally putting all of human civilization on one timeline. So, it's like first civilizations, like first states, like, different, but it's very much everyone in the world on the same page. So there has been, I think, for the Louvre Abu Dhabi, there's really been an attempt to collect as widely as possible to be able to tell global stories in their galleries. But it's very different in the Zayed National Museum. It's much, much more limited.
But of course, collecting broadly, but within a canon.
But within a canon, yes, within a canon.
And it's a canon that's very legible across the, museumscape of Europe, America, Asia, and so forth.
And particularly when it comes to contemporary art. So among contemporary artists, one of the things, it was originally a chapter, but did not make it to the final cut, that's about the creation of an Emirati art historical canon and the artists who were working in contemporary media that was easily legible as contemporary media. So painting, sculpture, installation, those artists, and having work that, Hassan Sharif, for example, is a conceptual artist. His work looks like contemporary art, like you would see at MoMA in New York. And this is not to say in any way that he does not deserve to be part of the Emirati art historical canon, but there were other artists that made work that was not as easily legible as contemporary art, and they often struggled to find their place in that burgeoning canon.
Interesting. Audience members, there's a mic waiting for you. It's very lonely up here. Yes. No.
Thank you guys so much for this great conversation. I'm going to ask a very book talky question, so I apologize, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about who you were talking to in these museums, like who your interlocutors were. I'm curious, if within the museum staff there was a party line about this is what we're doing, or if there were any tensions among different people. And then if there's time to also bring in how the artists saw themselves as either a cog in a machine or able to kind of do something within this broader structure. So just who were you talking to? What were they telling you?
Thank you. So I spoke with some people who were staff at the Louvre Abu Dhabi. I also spoke with, you kind of have to go talk to everybody. So I also interviewed a lot of people who worked at all other kinds of arts organizations in the UAE, including other museums that had existed prior to the creation of Saadiyat Island, as well as people who worked in commercial art galleries. And partly this was because it was very fluid, right? So someone might be one of my interlocutors was a curator at the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, and then moved to Dubai and was working in a commercial art gallery. So went from being a curator to working to being a gallerist, right? And people sort of moved between government and non-government entities, and public and private. And so there was a big variety. A lot of them were also artists on their own time. And so they would be maybe in shows in other institutions. So most of my interlocutors were at the time, we've all gotten a little older, between the ages of 20 and 50. They included, again, people who were artists, but maybe also had other jobs. And it wasn't just museum staff. I did typically interview the heads of organizations whenever I could get access to them. I found that, this is being recorded, but I found that those interviews were not the most informational because people tended to repeat what I could already find on the website. And so felt a little bit like a scripted performance. What was more interesting was having conversations with people who were not like directors of museums, because they were more engaged and able to sort of look at these institutions from within and also critique them, or they had been at multiple different institutions. So you could hear from people who had worked at a foundation and at a commercial art gallery and were now working for like the Department of Culture. So it was very mixed.
Recognizing my power. Thank you guys so much. This is really, really fascinating. Can I push back a little bit based on my ignorance? Because that makes it easier to push back on assertions when you don't know what you're talking about. On this notion that because these museums, both the Louvre and Louvre Abu Dhabi, see themselves as universal, I think you used the word, therefore, there is no national identity project. Because, if you go to Paris and you don't go to the Louvre, it's like you didn't go to Paris. It's not like you didn't do a global act, right? It is part and parcel of what it means to be in Paris. And it was very hard when we went to like Louvre Abu Dhabi. It was didn't feel like I was engaging in a universal act. It felt like I went to the UAE and I went to the place that I was supposed to go, which was Louvre Abu Dhabi. And now I can take those selfies, much like you can take the finger, stand on the plinth and put your finger on the pyramid and say you were there. And the reason I want to sort of, you might be talking about something different, but I was wondering if you can talk about this gap between both of you, actually, the theory and the reality of what a museum is supposed to be and what a museum actually becomes once it's being consumed. And I think this is picking up on topics that have already been discussed. You actually took almost every single one of my questions. So thank you. But I'm thinking that specifically because it's very hard. It's really interesting, but also hard for me to kind of map a museum like Louvre Abu Dhabi, which is a franchise of a national project. How does that fit into a franchise of another country's national project? How does that then fit into a burgeoning national project, considering all the history and power and stuff in the context of what's already been said? Sorry, that was long.
Can I just quickly add? So long story short, I experienced French immersion education. And so the first time I went to the Louvre Abu Dhabi, I felt like I was back in elementary school with this sort of sweeping civilizational narrative that I felt like I was cultivated into by virtue of being in a French immersion education. So to me, perhaps it's sort of a juxtaposition, but complementary to what you were saying. I was like, this is a quintessentially what read to me as a French space in Abu Dhabi. Now, that was at the beginning, and I don't know if exhibitions have changed, objects have changed, as you so beautifully lay out in the book. But that was my initial impression. I was like, oh, I'm back in France. Sorry, which can be a lovely thing, of course.
For the internet. So when you first walk into the permanent galleries in the Louvre Abu Dhabi, there's a map on the floor, and Abu Dhabi's on it. And it's a global map, and it really is, like I interpreted that as they're literally putting themselves on the map, right? And I think the goal of the museums, the goal of the was really also to drive tourism. There is concern in the Gulf about and sort of preparations for the end of oil, and this recognition that there is a need to build alternative economies. And I see even things like NYU Abu Dhabi as being a part of that, an attempt to build sort of infrastructures at home that can help and develop these other industries. And I think museums are one part of that. There are many others, but I think as things have progressed, I think it's also become quite a different Saadiyat Island. It seems to me that the goal of the museum, at least the things that have remained consistent, is that it is this desire to appeal to everyone as a tourist. That's universal. I would say the Zayed National Museum has much more of a feeling of being like in the Emirates, and having an Emirati national narrative. But at the Louvre, mainly what you see is putting the Emirates sort of in conversation with these other major players. So I think there's different sort of state branding goals that are being accomplished in the different museums.
Thank you. I think my question was very similar to some of the previous questions. So maybe I'll just build on it. I was sort of surprised by some of your characterizations. I'm a complete outsider, but I visited the Louvre Abu Dhabi years ago, right after it had opened. And it did feel, in my experience back then, very much like the main people they were talking to were the power players in Europe and the West. And you'd walk through the galleries and it would be like, here's our Van Gogh, here's our Picasso, here's our empty wall where our Da Vinci was meant to be that we've now disappeared.
It's now in Saudi.
Right? And there was some Emirati work, but it was sort of given very secondary importance. And there was very little mention of much of the rest of the world. And so it felt very much like this was a way for them to establish their identity to a very specific part of the rest of the world. And so I'm wondering if that has genuinely changed since then, given the way you're characterizing the project now, and also just, given the name and the amount they pay for the name. It's that's sort of very much the impression I had of the kind of project that the museum signified. And so I'm curious whether that's evolved over the last 6 or 7 years. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the Louvre Abu Dhabi was one deal, and then shortly after it, there was a military and arms deal that was announced within a few days shortly after it. So a cynical person might understand those to be connected. I do think it is really a work of cultural diplomacy. There's a book by Alexander Kazerouni, Le Miroir des Sheikhs, and he argues that the museums are mirrors of the sheikhs. It's literally that the whole project of the museums in the Gulf, not just also in Doha, is to establish closeness and build relationships with Western powers. I certainly think that's part of it. When I was there a few weeks ago, I was driving and Google Maps said, make a left on Jacques Chirac Street. So even the names of the streets are also like Jacques Chirac. There's even sort of cultural diplomacy in the names. And I will say one other thing that I think sort of goes to this point about tolerance and trying to become the space that's welcoming of everyone is that right across from the Louvre Abu Dhabi, there's the House of the Abraham Accords, which was not in the initial plans for Saadiyat Island, but was built after the Abraham Accords were passed in 2020. And that campus, it's right between the Louvre Abu Dhabi and the Zayed National Museum, and it has a church, a synagogue, and a mosque. And I think that is also, again, this idea that museums are being used to sort of establish diplomatic relationships with major Western powers and sort of prove tolerance in that way. I think the House of the Abraham Accords is also a key plug in that, a key component of that.
Might just squeeze in that, what we can see going on there isn't so different in kind from what the United States itself did at the beginning of the 20th century. So museum building, ties with cultural elites, it's not so different.
I mean, a lot of the arguments that people were sharing with me about sort of critiques of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, I'm like, well, first of all, who do you think built these other institutions? And not to say that there shouldn't be scrutiny, but these are, I think it's also kind of quite telling that people were saying exactly the same thing about the U.S. acquiring, all the nouveau riche in the U.S. They're acquiring all of the art of Europe, right? There was this sort of panic over that. And similarly, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art was created after the Civil War as a way of like unifying the country after this massive fracture. Sheikh Zayed, who was the founder of the United Arab Emirates, died in 2004, and these major museum projects were announced in 2006. Like there's so many parallels and continuities. Ian.
Yes. I have only made it through the first 18 pages, but I look forward to reading the rest. Partly because I guess I recognize you, Beth, as a fellow anthropologist of artistic expression, sort of in a broadly conceived. So I wanted to actually ask a question about sort of how you think about balancing an analysis that is attuned to these sort of geopolitical factors that we've been talking so much about, with to put it in perhaps too romantic terms, sort of the creative impulse, or the purity of artistic expression, or this is kind of picking up on an axe that I was grinding amongst some other junior fellows over dinner a few weeks ago. But I guess it's something that I'm constantly grappling with, even going back to ground this in a sort of early grad school anecdote. I remember going to, so as a grad student at NYU, Ilyas Suleiman had a brief sort of residency at Columbia in the film department. And there was, I went to a couple of the events that were sort of associated with his residency. And one of them was sort of this conversation with Elizabeth Pavanelli, sort of very well-known anthropologist, who tried to kind of frame the entire discussion through, Ilyas, famous Palestinian film director, as sort of cinema of resistance. And he really bristled at that. And he kind of, very clearly sort of repressing some of his anger about this was kind of like, well, this is, this is just my condition. It's not my fault that Israeli tanks are sort of parked outside my childhood home. Like, this is just my condition. And I poke fun at it. That's my sort of creative sort of impulse. Certainly like a performative kind of statement, right? But one that I think is like trying to defend a certain like creative impulse, right? So I'm just wondering, because you're obviously like your book, I gather, is, it's obviously very sort of attuned to the geopolitics and sort of the kind of political economy of museums themselves, but you also work with artists. And so I'd be curious to know more about sort of how you navigate that, or any frustrations that they sort of feel with having to sort of represent a particular political narrative, or work within certain political strictures, or where is the space for them for any sort of like freedom in their creative expression, and how do you sort of make space for that while, right, like dealing with all of these political dimensions?
So maybe I'll talk a little bit about the part on critique, because a lot of artists clearly felt pressure to include some sort of socio-political critique in their work, but they also, in a lot of these instances, if they had a particular passport or papers, they didn't want to jeopardize their residency status, because in some instances they couldn't go back to their country of documented origin. But they also felt the need to express critique. And so watching artists play within these boundaries of how do you express a critique without expressing a critique was really fascinating. And writing about their work was then also really challenging because there are no pictures of these artworks in the book, and I have to take out bits that describe that it's essentially their intellectual labor and their creativity and their genius of how they're going to, critique, this one artist I interviewed, she was critiquing Dubai's happiness campaign. And it was absolutely brilliant the way she did it. And I can't include a picture of it. And I have to sort of obfuscate enough details that she doesn't, because I can't be the one that, puts something in print that then leads to someone getting deported or losing their papers. And so there is this weird, there is an awkwardness and an incompleteness, I think, to being able to sort of sit with artists in their projects and also feel my first obligation as an anthropologist is to do no harm. And like, I cannot put something in writing that then causes someone harm. I think artists felt, some artists expressed that they appreciated playing in the margins and like having to be creative and play in that way. Others were not as happy if the restrictions on them. But it just really it kind of depended on their background and their situation. And I would say also, like, one of the things that I was really impressed by, there were a number of artists who had Emirati citizenship and who used that, for example, to like boycott institutions that were only showing Emirati citizens, that were not including people who, like had a Syrian passport but was born in Emirates and raised there and, speaks like Emirati dialect and everything. And so there were also artists that were doing their own sort of quiet boycotting and working to find ways to do things under the radar. And again, then how do you write about it in ways that then continues to protect the community, but also conveys the importance and the significance and the creativity of what they're doing? It's really challenging.
We have time for one. Yeah, please come up. Or two, you can both come up and yeah.
Hi, Beth. Congratulations on the book. So my question is very much related to what you're just asking and the conversations that you and I have been having, actually. It's actually an invitation to expand a little bit more on the concept of the contingent citizenship. As I was just hearing about the conversation and with the Abrahamic Accords, etc., I was just thinking of how most of the states in the region at the moment are kind of moving away from protecting or regulating or governing subjects through constitutionally enshrined rights, entitlements, etc. But then like forms of capital, as you put it, or patronage, these kinds of privatized almost networks, let's just say, have becoming increasingly prevalent. So I'm wondering, first of all, whether for your informants, the contingent citizenship was perceived as a sense of entitlement or as a sense of problem. Secondly, what were the contingencies of citizenship, really so practically on the ground? And thirdly, just having written this book right now and it's out of the picture, I'm wondering whether the concept itself can be used to actually understand, in your opinion, some of the broader dynamics that are operating in the region, not just museum politics in the Gulf. How can we, as other social scientists, actually come to think with you in the sense? Thank you.
So the artists that I describe as being contingent citizens, this really came out of speaking with one interlocutor who had an Emirati passport and it was taken away. And trying to understand how this artist worked and saw her work and also sort of looking at when artists chose to participate in shows and which ones they chose to participate in or not. And in this particular instance, this artist had been really sort of celebrated and published around as being an Emirati artist. And so when in the couple of years after this one quite significant exhibition, the artist was approached and invited to participate in a number of other shows. But a lot of these shows, quite materially, they ask for a copy of your passport in order to participate in almost all of these exhibitions. So a lot of these open calls, they require a copy of your passport. And so if you don't have one, and so this person's response was to kind of defer and say that they were busy and they couldn't participate. But because the emotional pain of having to say, well, I don't actually have those papers anymore, was not something that they were willing to say. And that was not something that they were willing to say to curators and gallerists that might also then share that information with other people, because this is this person's community and their livelihood and their identity. And so it was really quite challenging. But this the performativeness of the documentation of like constantly requiring, I mean, everything in the Emirates is about your residency visa. Like you can't get a phone line, you can't get an apartment, you can't get water in that apartment without your residency visa that's in your passport. And so that becomes like the sort of like choke point. For a lot of these artists, they expressed resentment at sort of not being included. They thought citizenship status was really kind of a silly thing to qualify an artist for an exhibition anyway. They're like, why does like my paperwork matter? Like you should be interested in how I'm talking about, the changes in the environment, or like, whatever they were talking about, or, criticizing some interpretations of Islam that they considered to be false. And they didn't think that their status particularly mattered. And so then it was like chafing to be only included at certain points because of your papers and not based on the merit of your work. And it felt, a lot of them expressed it, it was like identity politics that they disagreed with. There were also artists who played the game strategically, as we all, need to eat. And so there were also artists who sort of played with their positionality and used it to their advantage. But I think, I'm not sure if I have a really good answer to your final question about what this means for all of us moving forward. But I think it is certainly interesting to consider in a moment where identity politics, even as identity politics has become so loaded and a political weapon, it's almost a counterwashing to have people's affiliations not be listed or not be able to use certain descriptors to describe someone's particular status or positionality or background. In, for example, like federal grant applications and things like that. So.
Let's make a quick, because I know we're out of. Are we? I think it's. Well, we're good. Very, very short. This is the.
We started a few minutes.
One sentence. Is the Louvre free? Like, is it open?
No,
it's not. Okay, so
you gotta pay.
Okay, so who like? Do migrant workers go there? A little bit to your question about the public. Like, who is the public who goes to the Louvre? Is it accessible or not really?
I mean, I think it's sort of relatively the same. Most museums that charge money, it's like between $20 and $30 for an entrance fee. There are this sort of standard discounts for, like older folks or younger folks or students and things like that. I mean, I think a lot of it is tourists. But it's, I think it becomes, kind of as Nagmai was saying, it becomes a thing to do, is like to go have your picture taken.
Right.
I have not ever seen, again, it involves a lot of like judgment and sort of like profiling based on someone's appearance and how they're presenting in ways that I think are very suspicious, and would not recommend. But it seems that there's, places like Al Sarkal Avenue in Dubai or the Sharjah Art Foundation have very mixed populations attending them. I don't know that I've ever seen folks that I would assume to be migrant workers at these sites. But I know for a fact that Sharjah Art Foundation has had certain programming that is oriented towards migrant worker communities based in Sharjah. There has been a concerted attempt to be quite, particularly by Sharjah Art Foundation, to be quite inclusive in again, who that definition of public is, in ways that sort of get around, or in ways that are inclusive of like class and racial identity. But it is a very, kind of like a mall, it is a space where, people, there is a dress code, and people are behaving in certain ways, they're disciplined to behave in certain ways. And it is exclusive in that regard.
I will ask you to help me thank our speakers, especially the author. But before we do that, Gary, you're going to tell us about the lottery results, right?
Before I do that, I want to thank Beth and Noora and Attiya and Andrew for just a wonderful, wonderful session, really interesting. So as promised, the book and a water flask is available. And let me tell you what the winning number is, and you can go pick up your prize from, no, I've got it. Yeah, thanks, Christina. You can pick it up from Marilyn in the back. So number 67 is the lucky.
I'm surprised my son didn't scream.
Do we have a 67?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great. So you can pick up your prize back there. And I also want to remind those of you online, if you want to apply for the virtual raffle, you could do that on Instagram. Go to the Crown Center page, Crown Center Middle East. And if you click on the most recent video, there will be instructions. And you have to do that pretty quickly because the bidding ends at 8. I turn that over.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to Beth and the speakers. This was really a pleasure. Thank you also, Christina. Always takes care of everything. Marilyn, Ramyar. It's always a pleasure to work with the Crown Center because the people behind it are amazing and they always make sure every detail is taken care of. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.